Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. I've always been a live and let live kind of person. My neighbors were my friends, we looked out for each other, and everyone minded their own business in our quiet little suburb. I'd been living in the same house for about 12 years, watching kids grow up, seeing families come and go, and generally enjoying the peaceful life that comes with an established neighborhood. But that all changed the day the for sale sign came down next door and the U-Haul from hell pulled up. Let me give you some background first because the details matter here. My neighborhood was built back in the 1950s, and like a lot of older subdivisions, the property lines can get a bit weird. There was supposedly an HOA way back in the day, maybe in the early 1970s, but it dissolved sometime in the early 1980s when nobody wanted to deal with the hassle anymore. Since then, we've all just been regular homeowners doing our own thing. The house next to mine had been owned by this really nice older gentleman for as long as I could remember. Let's just call him Frank. Frank was the kind of neighbor everyone should have. He kept his place looking good, always had a friendly wave when you drove by, and if you needed to borrow a tool or had a package delivered to the wrong house, he was always helpful about it. Now here's where it gets interesting and why I'm telling you this whole story. My property has this weird little strip of land that runs along Frank's driveway. It's about 10 feet wide and runs the full 100 feet from the street all the way back to behind his garage. When I first bought my house, I did my homework and found out this strip was originally a utility easement from when the neighborhood was first built. The power company used it for some kind of equipment back in the day. Sometime in the 1990s, the power company abandoned the easement because they didn't need it anymore. When that happens by state law, the land ownership reverts back to whoever owns the adjacent property. In this case, that was me. So this 10-foot wide strip became fully mine, even though it sits right next to Frank's driveway. Frank and I had worked out a simple arrangement over the years. He kept the grass mowed on that strip since it was easier for him to just run his mower over it when he did his own yard, and I let him drive over the edge of it when he needed to make the turn into his garage. His driveway was kind of narrow, and his car was getting bigger over the years, so sometimes he needed that little bit of extra space to make the turn without scraping his bumper on his garage door frame. It was no big deal to me. The strip was just grass anyway, and Frank was a good neighbor. This arrangement worked perfectly for over a decade. Frank took care of that little piece of land better than I probably would have, and I got to help out a neighbor. Win-win for everyone. Then Frank decided to downsize and move to one of those senior living communities closer to his daughter. I was sad to see him go, but happy he was going to be closer to family. The house went on the market and sold pretty quickly. Real estate was moving fast in our area, and Frank's place was in great condition. I was actually looking forward to meeting the new neighbors. I figured anyone buying Frank's house would probably be pretty decent people since it was a nice family neighborhood. I was so wrong about that. The new owner moved in on a Saturday morning in late spring. I was out front watering my flower beds when the moving truck arrived, followed by a black SUV that looked like it cost more than I make in a year. I walked over with a bottle of water and a friendly smile, thinking I'd introduce myself and maybe offer to help carry a box or two. The woman who got out of the SUV looked me up and down like I was something she'd stepped in. She was probably in her mid-40s, perfectly dressed even for moving day, and had that kind of attitude that makes you instantly uncomfortable. When I offered the water and said I was her next-door neighbor, she just looked at me and said she didn't need any help and that she hoped I kept my property maintained properly because she had standards to uphold. I should have seen the red flags right there, but I gave her the benefit of the doubt. Moving is stressful, and maybe she was just having a bad day. I told her if she needed anything or had any questions about the neighborhood to just let me know, and I went back to my yard work. The first week was quiet enough. I saw her coming and going at odd hours, always in that expensive SUV, and noticed she was already making changes to Frank's landscaping. She had contractors there almost every day, putting in new plants, changing out perfectly good fixtures, and generally making a lot of noise and mess. Then I came home from work on a Thursday evening and nearly lost my mind. There were 3 metal signs staked into my front lawn, not on the property line, but a good 5 feet onto my property, creating some kind of fake boundary. Each sign was professionally made and read "Private HOA Property, No Parking" in big red letters. I stood there staring at these signs for a solid minute, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. There was no HOA. There hadn't been an HOA for over 40 years. And even if there had been, these signs were planted firmly on my property. I walked up to my front door and found a piece of paper taped to it. It was typed up on official-looking letterhead that said something like Architectural Committee at the top, with our neighborhood name and the word HOA in big letters. The letter was addressed to me personally and informed me that my mailbox was a non-compliant color and that I needed to cease and desist from mowing the HOA common area immediately. The HOA common area they were referring to was obviously that 10-foot strip next to the driveway. The strip that was 100% my property and had been for over 30 years. I stood there holding this fake official notice, looking at the metal signs stabbed into my lawn, and feeling my blood pressure rising. The ink on this official notice was still damp from her printer, but the entitlement was decades old. I've never been the type to go charging over to a neighbor's house screaming and yelling, but I also wasn't about to let someone claim my property and stick signs all over my lawn. I pulled the 3 metal signs out of my grass, grabbed the fake notice, and walked next door. She must have been watching from her window because she opened the front door before I even knocked. She stood there behind her screen door with her arms crossed, looking at me like I was there to cause trouble. I held up the signs and the paper and asked her what this was all about. I explained calmly that there was no HOA in our neighborhood, that it had been dissolved back in the 1980s, and that the strip of land she was claiming was actually my property according to my deed. She cut me off before I could finish and told me I was wrong. She said she was on the new HOA board, and they were cleaning up the neighborhood. She claimed her deed overrode my feelings about the situation and that the land in question was HOA property whether I liked it or not. I tried to explain again that there was no HOA and that I had the documentation to prove the strip was mine, but she just got more aggressive. She told me her lawyer had reviewed all the bylaws and that I would be hearing from them soon. Then she told me to get off her porch and slammed the door. I walked back to my house feeling like I just stepped into some kind of alternate reality. This woman had been in the neighborhood for 1 week and was already trying to claim my land and set up some kind of fake HOA. I dealt with difficult neighbors before, but this was something else entirely. That night, I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and really thought about what was happening. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a neighbor who was confused about property lines. This woman was actively trying to take my land through intimidation and fake authority. She'd made signs, created fake letterhead, and was claiming legal backing that didn't exist. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm also not stupid. I knew I needed to get my facts straight before this went any further. So I took the next day off work and drove down to the county recorder's office. Let me tell you, if you've never spent a day digging through property records, it's actually pretty fascinating once you get the hang of it. The clerk was helpful and showed me how to access all the documents I needed. I started with my own deed and the original subdivision plat maps from the 1950s. Everything was exactly as I remembered it. The 10-foot strip was clearly marked as part of my property on every single document. The original utility easement was noted, but there was also a reference to an abandonment filing from the 1990s. Then I pulled my new neighbor's deed. It was pretty standard stuff with one interesting detail. It did mention the old HOA covenants from the 1970s, but only as a historical reference. There was nothing in her deed that gave her any authority over other people's property or any right to establish a new HOA. But the real jackpot was when I found the utility abandonment files. These were old documents that had been scanned into the computer system, and they clearly showed that in 1994 the power company had legally abandoned their easement and transferred full ownership of that strip to my property. It was all there in black and white, signed and notarized. I made copies of everything and sat in my car in the county parking lot looking over the documents. That's when I really started to understand what was happening here. I pulled up the satellite view of our properties on my phone and studied the layout. My new neighbor's driveway was extremely narrow, probably built back when cars were smaller. Her massive SUV would need to swing wide to make the turn into her garage, and the only way to do that was by using part of my grass strip. Frank's old car had been much smaller, so he'd never needed to use as much of the strip, but this woman's vehicle was huge, and without access to my property, her garage was basically useless for parking. She hadn't just put signs on my lawn. She'd built her entire parking situation around land she didn't own, and she was trying to claim it through fake legal documents and intimidation. I drove home with a plan forming in my head. The first thing I did was write a certified letter to my neighbor. I kept it professional and factual. I enclosed copies of the plat map and the abandonment document and informed her that she, her signs, and her vehicles were prohibited from my property. I explained that the strip in question was private property, not HOA land, and that any further trespassing would result in legal action. I sent the letter certified mail so I'd have proof she received it, and I kept copies of everything for my records. 3 days later, I came home from work to find her SUV parked directly on my grass strip. Not just touching it or hanging over slightly, but fully parked on it, blocking access to where I normally kept my lawnmower. This was clearly a deliberate move to test my resolve. She'd gotten my letter and decided to escalate instead of backing down. I took photos of her vehicle on my property, including shots that clearly showed the license plate and the exact location. Then I sat on my front porch and waited. About an hour later, she came out to move her car. When she saw me sitting there, she made a big show of taking her time, acting like she had every right to be there. She didn't say anything, but the message was clear. She thought she could bully me into giving up. That night, I started researching my options. I wasn't interested in getting into a long legal battle or spending thousands on attorney fees, but I also wasn't going to let someone steal my property. I needed a solution that was both legal and effective. That's when I had my brilliant idea. I was looking at the satellite view again, thinking about access and usage rights, when I noticed something interesting. Our cul-de-sac was a popular spot for delivery trucks to turn around. UPS, FedEx, Amazon drivers, they all used our dead-end street as a turnaround point, and they often struggled with the tight space. What if someone needed dedicated access to that exact 10-foot strip? What if there was a legitimate commercial use for that land? I spent the weekend researching delivery companies and logistics operations. I learned that many of these companies subcontract with smaller local operations for last-mile delivery, and these smaller companies are always looking for strategic locations for staging and turnaround areas. Monday morning, I started making phone calls. I contacted several local delivery contractors and explained that I had a perfectly positioned piece of land that could serve as a dedicated turnaround and staging area. It was right off a main road, easily accessible, and in a neighborhood where they were already making regular deliveries. The third company I called was very interested. They handled overflow deliveries for several major shipping companies and had been looking for exactly this kind of arrangement. The owner came out that same afternoon to look at the property. He loved it. The strip was perfectly sized for their smaller delivery trucks to use as a staging area and turnaround point. They could load up for the morning routes, use it as a break spot during the day, and it would save them time and fuel costs compared to driving back to their main depot across town. We worked out a lease agreement for $500 per month. For them, it was a bargain compared to commercial property rates. For me, it was going to cover my property taxes and then some. But here's the beautiful part. As part of the lease agreement, they needed the area to be clearly marked as private commercial property. That meant fencing. I went back to the county office and filed all the proper paperwork. I applied for a change of use permit for that specific strip of land, changing it from residential to limited commercial use for delivery staging. I also applied for a permit to install a 6-foot commercial-grade chain-link fence along the entire 100-foot length of the strip. The county was surprisingly helpful with the whole process. The land use change was straightforward since it was a low-impact commercial use in a residential area, and the fencing permit was routine as long as it met setback requirements and didn't block sight lines. Everything was approved within 2 weeks. I scheduled the fence installation for the following Tuesday. The delivery company was eager to start using the space, and I was eager to see my neighbor's reaction when she realized what had happened. The fencing crew arrived at 7 in the morning on Tuesday. My neighbor's SUV was in her garage, and I could see she was getting ready for work through her kitchen window. The crew worked efficiently, setting posts in concrete and stretching chain link the entire length of the property line. By the time she left for work, they had about half the fence completed. She stopped her car and got out to stare at what was happening, but she was running late and couldn't really do anything about it at that moment. I watched from my window as she stood there for a few minutes, clearly angry but not sure what to do, before getting back in her car and driving away. The crew finished the job by mid-afternoon. The fence ran from the sidewalk all the way to the back of her property, parallel to her driveway and about 6 inches from the edge of her pavement. It was perfectly legal, properly permitted, and completely blocked her access to my grass strip. I spent the rest of the afternoon setting up the new commercial signage that my delivery company tenant had provided. Big signs that read, "Private property, commercial delivery, access only, no parking." Then I sat back and waited for her to come home. She arrived around 6:30, and I have to admit I was watching from my window like it was the best entertainment I'd seen all year. She pulled into the cul-de-sac and started to make her usual wide turn toward her garage when she saw the fence. She stopped her car right there in the middle of the street and just stared. I could see her trying to figure out how she was going to get her massive SUV into her garage with a 6-foot fence blocking her turning radius. She tried to make the turn anyway, but it was impossible. Her car was simply too big to make the sharp angle required without being able to swing out onto what used to be her access to my property. After a couple of attempts, she gave up and parked on the street. I watched her get out of her car and walk the entire length of the new fence, looking for some kind of gap or way around it. When she realized the fence was complete and permanent, she came marching over to my house. She was angrier than I'd ever seen another human being. She started pounding on my door and shouting about how I couldn't do this and how it was illegal and how she was going to have me arrested. I opened the door and stood there calmly while she yelled. When she finally paused to take a breath, I explained that this was my property, that it was now leased for commercial use, and that I had all the proper permits for the fencing. She demanded to see the permits, so I went inside and got the file folder with all my paperwork. I showed her the property survey, the lease agreement, the county permits, and the change of use approval. Every document was properly signed and filed. She accused me of doing this just to spite her, and I explained that I was simply making productive use of my property. The fact that it solved my trespassing problem was just a bonus. She threatened to call the police and the county inspector, and I told her she was welcome to do that. In fact, I encouraged it. Sure enough, about an hour later, I had a police officer and a county inspector at my door. My neighbor had called them both and was standing in my driveway holding her fake HOA paperwork and demanding they make me tear down my fence. The county inspector looked at my permits on his tablet and confirmed that everything was properly filed and approved. The fence met all code requirements and was entirely on my property. The police officer looked at the property surveys and explained to my neighbor that this was a civil property matter and that my fence was legal. When she started yelling about her garage access, the inspector pointed out that her driveway was on her property and my fence was on my property, and that any access issues she had were her own problem to solve. She stood there sputtering about HOA rights and her deed and her lawyer, but none of that mattered. The official response was clear, and this was my land and my fence was legal, and that was the end of it. After the police and inspector left, she tried one more time to convince me to work something out. She offered to pay me for access rights or to come up with some kind of shared maintenance agreement. I told her I already had a lease agreement in place and that the land was committed for commercial use. If she had done her research before buying the house, she would have known about the property lines and planned accordingly. The next morning, she had contractors at her house again. This time, they were working on her front yard, tearing up perfectly good landscaping and part of a decorative retaining wall to create a new, wider approach to her driveway. It took them 3 days and cost her a fortune, but they managed to create enough space for her to make the sharp turn into her garage without needing to use my property. The new approach looked terrible and destroyed most of her front yard landscaping, but it was functional. My delivery company tenant started using the space immediately, and it's worked out perfectly for everyone involved. Well, everyone except my neighbor. About a week after the fence went up, I got a letter from an attorney representing my neighbor. The letter demanded that I remove the fence and restore access to what they called community property. I forwarded the letter to a real estate attorney I found through my insurance company. He looked at all my documentation and sent back a response that basically said, my neighbor had no legal claim to my property, that all my permits were proper, and that any further harassment would result in counteraction for trespassing and filing of false claims. I never heard from their lawyer again. The whole situation has been resolved for about 6 months now, and life has settled into a new normal. My neighbor still glares at me whenever she sees me, but she stays on her own property now. Her expensive landscaping project to create the new driveway approach ended up looking pretty bad, and her garage is still barely usable because of the tight turning radius. Meanwhile, I'm collecting $500 a month from my delivery company tenant, which more than covers my annual property taxes. The delivery drivers are friendly and professional, and having them around actually makes the neighborhood feel a bit safer. I call it the Karen tax. Every month, she gets to look at that 6-foot chain link fence and remember what it costs to mess with a neighbor who actually reads their deed. She wanted to claim my property through intimidation and fake authority, but ended up learning that real property rights beat fake HOA paperwork every single time. The best part is watching her navigate that ridiculous tight turn into her garage every day. Her massive SUV barely fits, and she has to make a 3-point turn just to get lined up properly. Meanwhile, my delivery trucks have plenty of space to maneuver in and out of their designated area. I've learned that some people think they can just take what they want if they're aggressive enough about it. They assume other people won't fight back or won't know their rights. But sometimes those other people do their homework and find creative ways to solve problems. My neighbor thought she could bully me into giving up my property by creating fake authority and making demands. Instead, she ended up trapped in her own garage, looking at a constant reminder of what happens when you try to claim something that isn't yours. The delivery company is happy. I'm making money off land that was just sitting there anyway, and my neighbor learned a valuable lesson about property rights and due diligence. Sometimes the best revenge is just following the rules and making productive use of what's legally yours. The next one is a malicious compliance story. To make an already long story as short as possible, some background. I am a manager for a North American railroad, and a lot of our work involves different crafts of employees. Different crafts have different unions and different work rules. The managers of the other crafts and I work together well to get done what we need to get done, especially when some of the work needs to get done at night. The track guys can have a crew assigned to nights, while the signal guys can't. Even better, the signal guys who work overnight have to be let go after 12 hours, and if it's now their regular shift because they came in last night, they get paid the rest of the day to go home and sleep. Track guys have all 3 shifts, but we only have a day shift and an evening shift, but no night shift because the big hats don't want to hire enough people to do it. Now the company has decided that paying guys to go home 2 hours early on a Thursday, come in and work overtime all night at 10 p.m., and go home at 10 a.m., getting another 4 hours pay to go home and sleep is the ending of all that is good and pure in the universe, and will eventually lead to the collapse of capitalism, the nation, and indeed the universe itself. So they decide that the second shift guys have to stay 4 extra hours, and the first shift guys have to come in 4 hours early. I point out that 1. I can't force employees to work overtime unless it's an emergency, and the union isn't likely to agree that we want to do this at night so we don't affect traffic is an emergency. 2. Not all employees are qualified on the same things. 3. Since they took half of my trucks away 5 years ago, because savings, I don't have enough vehicles for an entire second crew to show up at 2 a.m. and relieve the guys working in the field so they can go home. The guys currently working will have to stop work, pack up the tools, drive back to the office, let the smaller relief crew load up, drive back out to the work site, do the starting paperwork and briefings, and begin the work. And most importantly, 4. That while we aren't there, the track guys can't work, because we have to keep taking things off of the rail so the track guys can do their work, and then put them back when the guys are done so we can run the trains in the morning. All of it falls on deaf ears because the freckle-faced college kid, who opens every conversation with "I have an MBA, damn it," who has somehow gotten to a position where he's in charge of the estimates, wants to complain about those 24 hours a night. So, after having gone on the meeting record for all of it, I get out of the kid's way. I decide that if my boss isn't going to have my back, I'm not going to stop this inevitable disaster. After all, I have only been doing this for 27 years, but he graduated with a 3.6 GPA from UTEP, so he must know better. So the first night the job grinds to a halt like clockwork at 1 a.m., the second crew shows up at about 4:15, and they get to work. The track folks pack it in, because by the time anything gets dismantled, there won't be enough time to get anything done and put it all back together to start moving trains by 7. Second night, the shift change was a little smoother, so they got out there at 3:45. Managed to get a little work done before packing up. Third and fourth night, it rained really hard, so the drive back to the shop and out to the job site took extra time. No work done after the new crew showed up at 4:30. Bright and early Monday morning, we show up at our morning meeting to find that the track guys got about 30% of the work done that they'd planned for the week, and at this pace would finish a 6-week job more than 15 weeks behind, and over budget by more than 300%. Mr. MBA proceeds to launch into his carefully rehearsed speech about key metrics, percent spent versus percent complete, and all sorts of other nonsense. Then he decides to start in on me, since I obviously conspired and colluded with my employees to egregiously erode progress for an entire week. I held up the meeting minutes from the previous week, told him in no uncertain terms that he had asked, in fact demanded, that we have a full shift change in the middle of the track department's work. I looked across the table at him and asked him if he wanted to revise that position. Completely unwilling to let this lowly engineer tell him what to do, he said no, and I was supposed to somehow magically make the shift change faster. Next 3 weeks were the same story. They've now been out there for a month, and have managed to accomplish just shy of a week and a half of work. Mr. MBA shows up on the site one night, just in time to watch my night guys walk off, watch the track guys shut down the machines and gather outside to smoke, hang out, and generally carouse, because they know they now have 3 hours to screw off and be paid for it. My guys had called me when Mr. MBA showed up, so I get out of bed and get to the job site just in time to see this guy in his shiny, fresh-from-the-package safety gear screaming at the top of his lungs to the guys to get back in their equipment and get them back to work. They all refuse because they all know that they can't work without us there. Not that they care all that much about our equipment, but because they know Mr. MBA has been throwing a little too much weight around. And nothing makes union employees stick together better or faster than putting the screws to a manager who really needs it. I walk up during a profanity-laced tirade and cut right in and say, "Well, Mr. MBA, I'm sure you're not suggesting that these qualified employees violate Rule 26, which clearly states that they shall not under any circumstances run that equipment through a switch that the signal department hasn't checked, would you? That would be a serious violation and could get him a 30-day suspension without pay. And if you were to suggest that he do that, you wouldn't have a union card in your pocket, and he would have 30 witnesses that saw you give him that directive. So you wouldn't be suggesting that, would you?" He turned 3 shades of purple, stomped back to his little white company sedan, and drove away. He held on to his asinine mid-shift shift change for another 2 weeks until he couldn't hide the massive production delays from his boss anymore, and suddenly he wasn't in charge of the estimates anymore. The total cost of his little venture? Just over $940,000 over the course of 6 weeks. But he did manage to save $700 a night on those off hours that he didn't have to pay for. The next one is an entitled people story. I'm currently dealing with a very annoying person in my religions class. I'm at college and pretty lonely, so when the person next to me struck up a conversation about the pins on my backpack, I jumped on the chance to exchange contact information and maybe have a new friend. This turned out to be a mistake. I will preface this by saying that both me and the person, who I will be calling M, are autistic. And pretty obviously so. I feel very bad that M genuinely doesn't realize how annoying they are. However, they have been told some of their behavior is disrespectful, and they continue to do it anyway. An easy example is M openly playing video games and scrolling TikTok without headphones in class. M also loudly makes commentary on videos shown on the projector and attempts to talk to me during readings even when told to be quiet. M somehow manages to annoy not only me, not only the professor, but I'd wager a fair guess as to them annoying literally everyone they come into contact with. Somehow this person manages to have a girlfriend. M has presumably even been threatened with getting kicked out of class if they don't shape up, which is why they stopped scrolling TikTok, but still manages to be a public nuisance. What I'm currently boiling about is how, for some reason, M has decided we are close friends after a couple conversations. I have to be strategic about when I go to the cafeteria because if M sees me, M will plop themselves down across from me and just start talking no matter what. I have my large noise-canceling headphones on and am on my phone looking at something. Perfect time to talk. Actively walking out the door? Don't worry, I'll follow you. I have even attempted to change seats in the cafeteria and in class, but every time, M follows me and sits down next to me again to keep talking. I admit that I never directly told M that I didn't want to be their friend and to go away, but I feel as though I have given pretty clear signs that have been soundly ignored, causing me to build up resentment. Edit. There was a comment I unfortunately couldn't respond to, but part of the reason I haven't told them to go away is because they tell me how sad or how lonely they'd be if I wasn't around, so it's good I don't try and leave. This all came to a head on Thursday when we were told to pick the groups for our final project of the semester. Immediately M spoke up saying, "OP and I will, blah blah blah." Excuse me? I never agreed to do anything with you. Throughout the entire class, even as I spoke to other people individually, M repeated that OP and I will do this, or OP and I will do that. You never asked. You never asked if I was alright with any of this. They were so annoying that we eventually ended up in a group together anyway because nobody would take them, and nobody would take me because of the association. I ended up unfriending them on Discord afterwards, and legitimately less than a minute later, they DM'd me asking if we were okay, if we were still friends, and what they did wrong. When I didn't respond, they even asked what specifically they did wrong so they could avoid it next time, which I also ignored because I couldn't in good conscience respond everything. Am I being selfish? Am I insane? I still have to do this project with them, but I feel like I don't deserve to be their minder just because I was polite to them a couple times. It hurts so badly because I see myself in my middle school self was almost exactly like them. But I've grown up and studied how not to make other people uncomfortable. Sometimes I still screw up, but when I do, I own up to it and apologize. M has never apologized once. There comes a point where it's not the inability to pick up social cues, but active wishful thinking. We barely know each other. Of all the things they've done and I've let them get away with, they crossed the line when, intentionally or not, they took my voice. I won't let that stand. I'm not sure how to move forward from here. Thank you for listening. If you've read all the way to the end, I'm open to anybody's thoughts or suggestions. Anyway, thank you for watching.